This morning, President Obama was in Manila in the Philippines giving a press conference, and the Fox News channel got in the last question for the president, and they got a rise out of the president in so doing. Watch.
As you end this trip, I don't think I have to remind you there have been a lot of unflattering portraits of your foreign policy right now. And rather than get into all the details of red lines, et cetera, I'd like to give you a chance to lay out what your vision is, more than 5 years into office, what you think the Obama doctrine is in terms of what your guiding principle is on all of these crises, and how you answer those critics who say they think the doctrine is weakness.
Well, Ed, I doubt that I'm going to have time to lay out my entire foreign policy doctrine. And there were actually some complimentary pieces as well about my foreign policy, but I'm not sure you ran them. Typically, criticism of our foreign policy has been directed at the failure to use military force. And the question I think I would have is, why is it that everybody's so eager to use military force after we've just gone through a decade of war at enormous costs to our troops and to our budget? And what is it exactly that these critics think would have been accomplished? The point is that for some reason, many who were proponents of what I consider to be a disastrous decision to go into Iraq haven't really learned the lesson of the last decade. And they keep on just playing the same note over and over again. Why? I don't know. But my job as Commander-in-Chief is to look at what is it that is going to advance our security interests over the long term, to keep our military in reserve for where we absolutely need it. And that may not always be sexy. That may not always attract a lot of attention, and it doesn't make for good argument on Sunday morning shows. But it avoids errors. You hit singles, you hit doubles. Every once in a while, we may be able to hit a home run, but we steadily advance the interests of the American people and our partnership with folks around the world.
President Obama today making some of the most extensive off-the-cuff remarks he has ever made about his approach to American power and the rest of the world. Why not war is generally preferable to war, especially if you can get what's in America's interests by means other than force. The president making those remarks today in the Philippines as his administration announced yet more sanctions against Russia for what the White House described as Russia's continued illegal intervention and provocative actions in Ukraine. This is the third escalation of not war tactics, these sanctions against Russia over the issue of Ukraine. Among the 7 Russian officials targeted today is this guy, the man here in close quarters with President Vladimir Putin. He's the former deputy prime minister to Mr. Putin, and he now heads up the Russian state-owned oil company, Rosneft, the biggest oil company in the world. If President Obama does ramp up sanctions even further, the most aggressive option that he's got is to take actions not just against individuals, but against the whole Russian oil and gas sector, which accounts for more than half of that country's economy. So far, President Obama has not done that. But as of today, he has targeted that guy. He has targeted the head of Russia's oil company. He's targeted him personally as an individual, even while the American company Exxon continues to announce yet further partnerships with that same Russian company whose chief executive has just been hit with White House sanctions. This headline out today. How long can Western oil companies keep doing stuff like that? And are these escalating but not war tactics working against Russia? And how would we know if they were? Joining us now is Michael McFaul. Until earlier this year, he was America's ambassador to Russia. He's now a professor of political science at Stanford. Professor McFaul, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
How does it work to be sanctioning essentially the CEO of the company, but not the company? How does that affect American firms making decisions about doing business in Russia?
Well, it means that they continue to do business and can continue to do business with the company Rosneft. It just means that Igor Sechin can't travel to the United States anymore. By the way, he hadn't traveled to the United States very much until he became the head of this oil company. But it also, I think, signals that there's more to come. I think that's what the administration was trying to do. They're trying to say, we are serious about this. If you escalate violence in eastern Ukraine, we're going to go after not just Mr. Sechin, but perhaps the banking sector, the energy sector in Russia.
I recognize that the strategy here is to leave further room to grow, essentially to do these things incrementally so that you can still, you have somewhere else to crank to if Russia does something else. But is the basic idea here, and I don't know if this exists in diplomatic speak, but is the basic idea here that there's only one person who is the target of sanctions, that all decisions that matter are President Putin's decisions, and so only sanctions that bother him have a chance of a policy impact?
Yes and no. I would say there are two kinds of sanctions that have already been done and are being threatened. So the ones you see so far, they're to punish Putin's inner circle. If you look at the list today, it's clearly designed to punish those people. And I don't think anybody has any illusions that, because we've done this, Putin's going to change his mind. But the prospect, the specter of these sectoral sanctions, that's to raise the costs in Putin's mind about going into eastern Ukraine and annexation. That's different. That is going to affect the long-term economic health of Russia. So that wouldn't be about him precisely. And that's why it has to be preemptive, right? Because once he goes in, then you're going to be forced to do sanctions, and then you're in a game of lock-in. You're not in a game of trying to change his calculus. Right now, they're trying to change his calculus about further military intervention in Eastern Europe. Eastern Ukraine, excuse me.
How is the U.S. doing in terms of lining up the rest of the world, lining up the EU and the other countries that matter to Russia in terms of its economic interactions around this strategy? Where have they succeeded and where have they not succeeded?
Well, they're working hard, as best I can tell, and President Obama just yesterday, I believe, said we don't want to get ahead of the Europeans, we want to be in concert, and I think that's right, because if not, then they can pick and choose who they work with. But we have different economic interests. We're less exposed than the Europeans are. It reminds me when I was in the government about the debate we had with our European allies about Iran, where they had more business, they had more banking relationships with Iran. We had nothing to lose, so it was easy for us to be tough. It's a bit like that. And, you know, there's push and shove. I think it was striking, for instance, that the head of Gazprom, Mr. Miller, was not on the list today. So
we had the head of the Russian, essentially state-owned oil company is on the list, but the state-owned gas company not on the list.
Correct. And I don't know why, but if I'm guessing, maybe because of Europe's exposure to Gazprom, that might have been a reason.
Europe needs Russian gas more than they need Russian oil, and so that's a bigger jump for them.
Correct.
In terms of what happens next here, the president today, the reason I played those remarks sort of at length, and he went on for even longer than that.
Striking to me.
First of all, he's very confident in the way that he's talking about this. He's obviously put thought into it, and he's obviously very bothered by the criticism that was put to him by that Fox News reporter saying, you're weak. And the president reads that as, you're telling me I'm weak because I'm not bombing anybody. That's not the way that my strength should be measured.
Right.
Is that an animating dynamic inside the White House and inside this administration and the State Department more broadly when they're making foreign policy decisions? The fear of being called weak, the need to defend non-military action as actions of strength.
Not for President Obama. I mean, I worked for him for 3 years at the White House, and the last thing he's thinking about is whether Ed Henry is calling him weak or not. You heard a bit of that flippancy in his answer. He wants to achieve results within the constraints and within his foreign policy philosophy that he thinks the American people have elected him to execute. So on Ukraine, there's not a military option. There's no military option available. Instead, what you see, I think, is a very aggressive administration using non-military means. Let's be clear. Tell me the last time Russian government officials have been sanctioned by a president of the United States. Didn't happen under Ronald Reagan. Didn't happen under Dwight D. Eisenhower when we were rolling back communism in Eastern Europe, which is to say that we're not going to use military force. By the way, neither did Reagan, neither did George W. Bush or President Eisenhower. But they are trying to inflict, I think, a rather aggressive policy to try to stop Putin from further aggression in Ukraine.
I believe that had this been George W. Bush taking these actions, the left would be paying them a lot more attention, because I think the left would be very worried that they were too aggressive, and the right would be praising him as Reagan. But because it's President Obama doing it, the right is defining it essentially as weakness, and the left isn't paying attention.
George W. Bush faced Russian intervention into Georgia. Not a single Russian government official was sanctioned by the Republicans.
Yeah, but he swaggered when he didn't do it. Michael McFaul, former ambassador to Russia. It's really helpful to have you to talk to about these things. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. We'll be right back.